Classicism has changed over 3,000 years. It's gone from temples to schools. It's changed when it's been required to do so, and it could do again.
Modern comfort is just technology, and you can put that technology into any sort of container. This is probably the first time in history that's been possible.
Just opening a door that swings on hinges rather than slides. We just like that more. I'm Timothy Smith.
I'm Jonathon Taylor.
And we are Smith & Taylor Architects.
For me, I love classical architecture. I think it's beautiful. Equally, I also like modern buildings and lots of modern interiors. And I guess a lot of the mod cons that come with a more modern building. Can I have all the modern amenities within a classical concept or classical looking building? And I guess really drawing in line with a lot of current thinking, and I guess a big theme is environmentally conscious buildings. If I was to say, could I have a passive house classical building? Is that possible?
Well, absolutely you can. I think lots of the sort of building technologies which are becoming, lots of the green building technologies which people are increasingly using are very well suited to kind of an architecture that has a lot of mass in it. I mean, most traditional building materials are kind of sustainable. Things like lime mortar, lime renders. Stone itself is incredibly sustainable. You expend very little carbon taking it out the ground. So I think it's absolutely possible to have a kind of a modern, sustainable and comfortable classical architecture.
Yeah, and specifically when it comes to passive house, that's a matter of adding high levels of insulation and airtightness to that arrangement. And if you think about a Regency or Georgian house, essentially a sort of a cube, then that's a very good ratio. Whereas more sort of sprawling modernist designs, so you think of classic modernist buildings and the sorts of things you see in magazines, have really quite a low a high ratio of surface area to the volume. So they're harder to make passive house. But there are all sorts of ways that different countries, jurisdictions, building regulations might measure environmental performance. And I think as an architect, it's a matter of balancing the benefits of each. So passive house and adding, say, solar technologies is one approach, but lowering embodied carbon by building in stone and mass timber, for example, is another. And they're not necessarily the same thing. And I think it's the architect's job to balance the various statutory requirements, but also clients' own requirements for environmental performance alongside all other things.
So we're almost winding back to using materials for a lot of the performance metrics that a lot of people are trying to hit now. We're seeing more and more buildings built out of timber, which is a historic building material. It's interesting how things go in cycles.
Yeah, that's something that the classical, various classical or traditional building organisations have been saying for quite a long time, well before sustainability, that you should source materials locally. You shouldn't ship them around the world. They're easier to maintain and to repair than complex layered systems with aluminium and glass and things like that. And some of that came out of the style wars. I think it's a very reasonable position to take on traditional architecture, but I think also the opposition to glass and steel was partly a sort of style wars thing of the 1980s and 90s. And those things are coming together. I think modern architects are looking at traditional building methods or traditional building materials, even though they might not be embracing the style, the vernacular and more classical style that we're interested in. We know that it's pretty expensive to build exactly the way we did 100 or more years ago. And so there are products like cross-laminated timber, terracotta blocks, which are almost glued together rather than mortared, and they have air pockets in them, so they insulate. So you don't have to add petrochemical insulation to the insides of them. There are all sorts of very innovative things that modern architects are excited about. And we think the combination of them with a traditional approach to the sort of look and feel of a building is new, and no one's really doing it yet.
What are the kind of biggest changes that you've seen and you talk about through your teaching that modern builders or builders of today are using or can use to create those looks of those classical buildings, but in a more economical fashion?
Well, if you think about John Nash's architecture around Regent's Park, what you see is painted stucco. What's behind that stucco really could be anything. There are obviously some construction techniques that get the heart racing a little bit more than that, but it would be absolutely possible to create these forms in stucco, applied to almost any substrate. So there's definitely a conversation to be had there with the industry.
Even people doing sort of very high-end classical buildings are making sort of enormous use of CNC to carve stone. It's still quite expensive work, but it's a lot less expensive than it might have been without the CNC. You know, and it also, you know, in terms of the construction program, it's what would take a mason a month to carve. You know, the CNC machine can do, you know, in maybe 3 days. You've reduced to probably less than a week something that would have taken a month to make. So that obviously has, you know, cost implication.
Yeah.
So I think there's kind of a sort of an exciting confluence of highly traditional materials and techniques, like, you know, sort of lime stucco and things like that, together with, you know, really the latest techniques in sort of computer modelling and then CNC carving. You know, all this stuff comes together. Yeah, this is probably the first time in history that's been possible. You know,
I've always wondered. You know, you kind of look at the craftsmanship in these stone buildings and going, I wonder if you could get a CNC machine to crank a lot of this stuff out now to create those facades, which would have taken perhaps even hundreds of years to create. Whereas actually now, with the machinery we have and computer-aided design, you could do it so quickly. Do you get a feel for what the limit is of CNC machining versus, you know, an artisan craftsman?
I mean, I think the CNC machines can do pretty much anything depending on the machine, but they do tend to leave these sort of slight ridges, you know, as the bit works over, and those things I think are best dealt with by a mason, sort of. And I suppose potentially some very deep undercuts might not be possible, but you know, the really sophisticated machines can do almost anything. I mean, you then have to have a very skilled person who builds the 3D computer model to feed into the CNC machine. So, you know, the process is certainly not craftsman free. I don't think you'd want to lose the kind of the human hand, the input of that on certainly the stuff that you can see or that's very close to you. Maybe if there's things way up on the roof that you know you can only see from ground level, then it'd be perfectly acceptable, and a CNC machine could, you know, knock those out pretty quickly.
It's also not necessarily the case that classical buildings need to be covered in ornament and stone. Okay, the town hall or the major houses, the doctor's house perhaps, have got some, are embellished with some lovely carving. But most buildings aren't, and some of the mouldings they have might have been mass produced at the time a couple hundred years ago. And conversely, it's also true that high-end modern or modernist buildings are not without craft, and it's usually that something that's very highly regarded from classic modernism of the 1920s and 30s through to today, that architects have worked with artists, sculptors. The cost and sort of practicality of certain construction techniques is not a particular issue for new classical architecture. It's an issue for really ambitious architecture, very creative architecture, and projects can vary from the extremely one-off, high-end, ambitious, down through projects to quite everyday things, and we're interested in all of them. Every project has its aim and its budget, and the task is to get the best for whatever the client's looking for.
Yeah. When you get that phone call from a new client, what's going through your mind? Are you hopeful that it's that one client who's going to want a Yorkshire Cathedral style epic facade, or is it actually your interests are far different from that? I'm intrigued of what classical architecture means to you, and what is the pinnacle. And
I mean, what we hope for is a client who we can have a really fruitful conversation with at first and relationship with as architects who've been working and teaching for some time and who trained ourselves for a few years. It would be lovely to build some public buildings, civic buildings. Not many classical architects do that in this country. Having said that, we really enjoy domestic work and the relationships we have with our clients, getting to know them and how they live. If the work is to an existing building, getting to know that building well is an absolute pleasure. That's why we do what we do. It's a creative relationship, I suppose, we're hoping for.
Yeah, and we want, I suppose the ideal client is also creatively ambitious as well. So that they want to do something good, something that they recognise as good as well, which is not, and that's not sort of about kind of architectural showing off, but you do get projects where sort of everything comes together. Our sort of skills, I suppose, and our kind of natural inclinations, the client's interest, and when all those things align, and the client, as I say, wants to do something which, which they're proud of, then that's a really enjoyable process, and that is kind of ambition for the right reasons, not necessarily for kind of sort of showing off.
Yeah, the other thing we are hoping for when the phone rings is a client who trusts us, and obviously you'd hope in a professional relationship that there is trust, but it's a trust in our judgment, I suppose, and there can sometimes be a worry, I'm not quite sure where it comes from, that your architect has some sort of mysterious agenda that isn't going to match the client's own. And we certainly don't. We have our interests. And as architects, we are, us and our peers are part of a professional and creative tradition that has very deep roots. Obviously, we're interested in that, and there's certain things that we're interested in that sort of apply across all the projects we might do. But for an individual client, we want the best result for them. We want our interests and their requirements to align. And sometimes you get clients who can just never let go. They feel they have to put their stamp on something, sometimes in quite arbitrary ways. So there's a project years ago when we suggested some colours for, I think, a hallway in a mansion flat in West London, and the client came up with something else, and we said, well, we really don't think that's right for the apartment, for the other spaces and the other colours we'd specified. And the client said, well, yes, but you don't have to live with it. As if we'd suggest something that was really, you couldn't live with it, it was unlivable, and that we'd want to force something on them that they really hated. We offered our advice, and the client can take it or leave it, but that phrase, you don't have to live with it, was almost hurtful, really, in its mistrust or distrust. So it's not in our interest at all to provide a client with something that they feel they're having to live with. And some issues really take some resolution. They take a lot of discussion. They might take some visits to equivalent things. They might need us to show them lots of examples. And other things are done very quickly. And obviously for us, clients who trust us and say yes are a lot easier to deal with, but we know that's not every client. We know that's not every decision.
How does a client gain that trust? I mean, trust is earned, and you said you'd love a client to come to you that already trusts you. I guess unless that's a repeat client, it's nigh on impossible. So what is your journey to try and gain that trust, I guess, as quickly as possible so that they can then get fully on board through your process?
I suppose initially, just when you first meet people, you have to be sort of quite honest about what you can do. Ideally what you hope is people are coming to you because they've looked at something else you've done
Yeah.
And liked it. And so that's the first step. That's sort of isolating you. That suggests a certain amount of kind of aesthetic trust. I think it's mostly about sort of slightly boring answer, but I think it's mostly about communication. Just showing them stuff, showing them options. Saying we've considered these things. Often we'll do, 8 options on something, any of which could work, and then maybe we'll show the client 2, which we think are the best ones. But sometimes you do have to go back and say, well, actually, look, we did 8 of these, and that has convinced us that these 2 are the best.
It's very difficult, though, isn't it, of how to create that trust from day one. But maybe you hit the nail on the head with it being that blunt honesty, and you're proving it by doing that initial design process. Is that something you go through with every one of your clients, that they come to you and you go away and you sketch up 1,000 different options to hone down to that one? Talk me through that process.
Yeah, sometimes with different projects there are more options, and sometimes that will be inherent in the project. So we're doing a small project in Hackney at the moment for a mansard roof extension. Very nice clients who are neighbours of clients we worked for several years ago, and it seemed really clear. Well, certainly within planning constraints, it was really clear what the external form of the project would be. Because of where the stairs are, there's only one place the stairs could be. We thought, this is a really speedy one. There's probably only 2 or 3 options for where you put the bathroom and where you might want your bed. And as you get closer to the one that works, the tweaks are smaller. But by the time we got to the penultimate one, there was quite a switch. And we said, actually, why don't we just move the bathroom over the other side of the space? So sometimes it's some of the smallest projects we do, and also the apparently most constrained ones might have the largest number of options. I think there's, going back to the communication question, just an honesty or willingness to ask at the very beginning the difficult questions. How do you live? Well, how do you live might be a difficult one for a client to answer. It's an easy one to ask, but how much money have you got? Clients always think their money's going to go further than it will. They always think that things can be done quicker. Very often they think they can rewrite how a construction project is procured and managed. It exposes our knowledge, I suppose, when you're honest about that, and you're not just saying, yeah, we could do it quicker. Yeah, I'm sure you could get more for your money than so-and-so down the road, which is what you might expect of certain other professions or trades. So sometimes it doesn't get you the job. Sometimes we feel we're the bearers of bad news, but I think it's also something that the client can go away and think, the other people didn't tell me that, and they might have a point.
But in terms of our sort of working process, when we first sort of put pencil to paper, it tends to be kind of quite collaborative. I mean, as the project goes on in the office, then one or other of us tends to take care of it more. But at the very beginning, we're sort of both working on it and sort of passing the sketches between us, which I think is kind of real strength, because we're both good, or so let's say slightly better at different things. And so that's one of the great things about a partnership, is that you also have the input of that other person in all sorts of ways, and I think that really helps to make the projects richer.
Do you find through that collaborative process, a lot of clients come to you with preconstrued ideas of what they want and really force their idea upon you, and you're kind of almost acting a little bit defensively, trying to take that, absorb it, and guide them to what perhaps, based on your experience, they really want? And a lot of your process is trying to extract those ideas and through those many sketches kind of inch them towards what they feel and connect with. Yeah,
it really varies depending on the client, and we feel obliged to present alternatives to them, even if they do think they have a very clear idea of what they need, and sometimes they accept them and sometimes they reject them. And I think the different options and different approaches is we always emphasise to clients, look, there are 5 different options here. None of them are going to be the final one. None of them are going to be right. But there may be part of some or all of them that you'd like to apply or that are going to work for you. So please don't just say what you think about each one. What do you like about each one? What do you not like about each one? And there'll be another 5. I think mostly the clients really enjoy that. Even if there's an idea they reject, they really like that it's been presented to them. They like thinking it through and imagining how they might live with something. And sometimes the client says, "Oh, well, will you push it further? Will you really show me why it doesn't work? Well, the stair doesn't fit, or whatever it may be." Maybe it prevents the client from doing something that we'd understood to be really important to them. And they say, "Actually, I know I said that, but that's not so important to me. I like the thing you were pursuing."
How do you put these ideas across? I mean, drawing, for you, I guess you can visualize that drawing in a 3D sense. And that's one of the innate abilities, I guess, as an architect with your training. How do you find, and what's the variety of your clients' experiences of being able to see that drawing and go, yeah, that's the one for me? Or are you using more modern techniques now? Things like VR, where you can effectively have someone in that room, in that building, in that auditorium, whatever it may be, so they can get a sense. I'm intrigued the kind of different types of clients and how they can take a picture that you sketch to something they can feel.
I mean, I think different clients respond to different sort of media in different ways. But we find that some clients really love the idea that everything's in the computer. It's sort of mapped out to an incredible precision. But other clients really love a soft pencil sketch, and I think both can be equally communicative. But there is something very nice about a physical model because you're looking at real space with real light falling into it. If you present someone with a photorealistic visualization, it can seem too final because it looks like it's there built in front of you. So I think some clients, who are sort of taken with the imaginative aspect of this journey, because it is, particularly with domestic clients, it is kind of a fantasy. You're helping them achieve this kind of fantasy they've had for their home.
Yeah. So bring it to life, but don't give them the final article too early. I guess you just try and extract it out of them. Why is that so important to you to have those kind of classical touches through buildings?
Well, for quite a while, our interest in classicism did not necessarily align with our clients' desires for their projects. And there are certain classical traits that we would bring into projects, something that they would not recognise as classical, but for us was starting to explore how you can bring the classical language into conversation with a more sort of readily received contemporary modernism, I suppose, something like that, the sort of thing the clients might have seen in magazines. And as we developed more of those projects, then we did do a project with freestanding brick columns, and it's actually something, this sensitive series of decisions ended up resulting in some freestanding columns. But this was for a client who'd said right at the beginning, I know you're interested in classicism, let's be clear, I don't want columns. But it wasn't so much a matter of us sort of forcing our interests on the project, but the project just moving that way and explaining why we thought these columns would help the appearance. They weren't structural in any way. How they'd help space and how they would help to give a very easy relationship between the room and the garden that wasn't just a wide set bifold doors, but was actually sort of in practical terms just as open as that.
I think with that particular client, we were talking a bit earlier about trust, and she said, I'm not sure, but I wasn't sure about other stuff you suggested, and now I am sure about it. So although I'm not sure about these things, kind of based on my previous experience, I think we should do it, because I think you will be right, even though I can't picture it at the moment.
Yeah, not all classical buildings have to have columns, and we wouldn't force a column on a building that didn't want it. But they're also, a lot of contemporary architecture can be quite characterless. We sort of see classical architecture as figurative. So sometimes we use the comparison with going to an art gallery. If you go to Tate Britain and you look through the traditional galleries, you'll see pictures of people and things that you recognise, and they'll be made in all sorts of different ways, different styles, different media, different sizes, different colour palettes. You'll like some and you won't like others, but they can. You're able to not like them. They communicate with you quite immediately. And if you do like them and you put the study in, they will be almost endlessly more enriching. But with architecture, you have to look at it. You have to engage with it if you walk past it on the street or if it's your home or your place of work. And we think that if that can have a sort of figurative character, as buildings used to when this was just the standard way of doing things, it's a way that the layperson can read a building. And the column gives that sense of figuration and personality, that if it also works from a practical or spatial point of view, perhaps to turn a corner or to slightly sort of delimit one space into the next, then that's all for the good.
What first interested you in classical architecture? What point in your life were you riding around on a bike as a young teen going, that's the kind of stuff that I'd like to live in one day, and that's kind of what planted the seed? When did it happen for you? And
we weren't into classical architecture when we were teenagers. I suppose, we were thinking about doing architecture, but I was probably more excited about modern stuff and funny shapes. Nowhere in the UK or Europe at the time taught classical architecture. So it was just, as a young person, I thought the modern stuff was much cooler. And that's what you did as an architect.
Yeah, it was the only option.
It was the only option, and it's also just what I wanted to do. I suppose we came to classicism through thinking about buildings and what they should be and how they could speak to people. Not because that's how we were brought up or that we were somehow otherwise indoctrinated in it. And then we really decided it would be a good thing to do. We were sort of thrown into setting up practice, probably quite early through the 2008 credit crunch. At the time, it was sort of towards the end of the minimalist sort of movement, and architects have been looking at materials and using plywood and sort of authenticity of material. Thought, well, architecture can't get any more plywoody than this. It can't get any more bricky than this. So we can't push in that direction anymore. And some architects were starting to talk about ornament and historical reference, and they were translating it and abstracting it so much. We thought, oh wow, that Philip Webb building's amazing that they're looking at, or that William Chambers building. Yeah, I know that, and it's amazing. It's really interesting what they're saying about it. But why does their resulting architecture look nothing like it anymore? Surely there's a space there. Surely it's okay to do new classical buildings. And then we had arguments in the pub with other with our peers who said, no, it's just not appropriate. It's not technically appropriate or politically appropriate or aesthetically appropriate. And we thought, well, you don't need to be a genius to look at the history of architecture and realise that classicism has changed over 3,000 years. It's gone from temples to schools and skyscrapers in New York rooted in the classical tradition. It's changed when it's been required to do so, and it could do again. And we thought, well, that's quite an exciting thing to start your career on.
More modern buildings have, in my opinion, and I'm interested in yours, have become, because, I don't know, technology has allowed them to be so. So, glazing standards, beam sizes, materials have allowed bigger spans, bigger openings. But we go in cycles, and you look at the buildings around us, and those that have stood the test of time, they are typically classical in nature. The buildings that people go to visit out of interest are classical in nature. Everyone says build for today, but does today have to be a modern building, or can today still be a classical building and give you those luxuries and feels inside that everyone craves?
Yeah, absolutely it can. Lots of modern comfort is just technology, and you can put that technology into any sort of container.
The classicism of the 20s in Hollywood is pretty amazing. And I think there could, in certain situations, be some sort of response that is maybe a hybrid between the case study houses in LA and classicism. I think a hybrid's possible. We love classic modernism, and in certain places it works really well, and the climate and the lifestyle suits it. It's also really nice, just opening a door that swings on hinges rather than slides. And we just like that more.
Rather moving sort of 3 tons of, of triple glazing.
And we like that interaction with buildings too, the door handles, the ironmongery. The idea of of course we could do this if a client insisted, but the idea of a building that's controlled from an iPad, to us, feels a bit miserable. You spend all your life on the iPad doing other things. When you want to open a door using a beautiful piece of bronze ironmongery that may be custom made on some really high quality hinge bearings, to open up, to step back while, that action of opening a door, just something really lovely about that.
I guess this is almost the difference between jumping into a Tesla-like vehicle that has a beautiful screen in the middle that does everything versus something that's got some refined dials that you know exactly where it is and how it should work intuitively. That door handle versus a digital panel.
There's a firm I've seen on Instagram who take 1980s Range Rovers and they completely refit them. So they've got all the charm, the aesthetic charm and sort of feel of that old Range Rover, but there's the port for your phone and the brakes are upgraded and the mechanics have been looked at and all the leather's been redone and they've got bespoke luggage that fits in, all the things you'd expect of a brand new Range Rover. They just look 1,000 times nicer than the latest Range Rovers. So maybe that is a sort of crude analogy.
I think a lot of people would like to jump in that Range Rover.
I think there's also in classical architecture a really strong relationship between the scale of the architecture and considerations of the garden and the interiors. Almost all projects, we start talking about the garden and we work with garden and landscape designers, but we're also able to propose simple schemes and also to help brief those designers, and we're interested in the relationship between the two. And the same with interiors. We don't often work with interior designers, and we're very happy to, but that conversation about the boundary between one and the other and almost whether it's a brief from us or ideally it's a bit more of a conversation between us about where our ideas for the spaces stop and theirs begin. We're very interested in those relationships and architecture as a profession and an art in relation to its allied arts.
If someone was to ask you what the soul of Smith & Taylor is, how would you describe it?
Modern architecture with traditional virtue.
And to the lay person, what does that mean?
You'll have the kind of modern product you expect.
Well, it's designed for modern living. We've got modern clients, but I suppose what we'd hope is that the architecture is drawing on this kind of wider sort of cultural hinterland.
A sense of timelessness. Sense of timelessness and rightness, which is also new. I mean, that is a big thing for clients, isn't it? It's new. And when we don't wish it was the 19th century. We just think that the architecture of the 19th century had a lot of good things about it. I suppose that's what we mean by virtues. Some connection to the sorts of buildings people like, and it's clear that they like them from the premium that period properties command on the property market. So you can have the old stuff, but with the new performance and the new qualities.
How does an older classical building make you feel when you're walking around it versus a more modern version? So you're saying that you're aligning modern and classical. Is there a different feel? Does it make you feel different when you're in those buildings in any way?
We've been very moved by recent architecture, which is not at all classical, and arguably is trying not to have the traditional virtue we just mentioned, or it's emphatically trying not to be an old building. I think there's a slight danger in weighing up the classical versus modern too much. But a new classical building really ought to display the care about proportions and appropriate use of materials and mouldings and classical orders and things like that, in very much the same way that they always have done.
I think it's being alert to the qualities you want for the space, and being alert to the way that you can recreate the qualities you admire in the older buildings that you've seen. Obviously we're constrained by modern construction in many ways, but where there's a choice between 2 inches of lime plaster and a single skim of gypsum plaster, we'd obviously go for the 2 inches of lime if we can, because it not because it's the way that it's always been done, but because it gives you a genuine better kind of feel, sort of atmosphere and acoustic.
Does classical building therefore really mean just built better?
I mean, kind of, but not exclusively. I think in the sort of the early Victorian period, people were throwing up terraces. I think the whole of sort of London must have virtually been a building site at one stage, and lots of these buildings are actually quite badly built. I mean, having said that, they're built well enough to last 150 years or something, but they're not examples of master craftsmanship. But it's no use just putting some columns on the facade if the interior is badly planned and is sort of poorly built in many ways. Even if it's a very high quality modern build, it can still feel sort of too hard. The corners are all a bit too sharp. So I think it's trying to get some of the atmosphere that we admire from the character that we admire from older buildings, which is absolutely achievable in new buildings, but you need to consciously aim for it.
Most often it's the best buildings, the most loved buildings that are saved. Not always. Some of them have been destroyed, mostly in the 20th century, but the Victorians did a lot.
Well, this building
of destruction.
This building was taken down and moved.
This was taken down and moved, and then moved back here. So obviously we're inspired by things that have lasted a long time, and a lot of the time that's because they have been good, they've been beautiful, they've been well built, and people have loved them. But it would be absurd for us to say, oh well, we love St Paul's Cathedral, and so that's the major influence in our practice. A lot of our work is the same tussle that I think any good architect is going to be having, a balance between the way you'd like to build, the way contemporary construction culture and budgets will let you build, and how much the client's on board with that.
I mean, how do you decide when to kind of honour those traditional buildings in your designs, and when do you decide, actually, let's ignore that?
I think we're always thinking about them and aiming for that quality of construction and space. But I suppose most of the time what you're dealing with is sort of more prosaic, and it's a spatial. Mostly, I would say the influence of the older buildings we're interested in is about space and qualities of space, and achieving rooms that have a good kind of harmony in themselves, or it might be symmetry. It's not always symmetry, but a certain balance and composition as a good room in relation to the rooms around it. And I think that maybe is the fundamental lesson that we try to teach our students, is that you can think about one room. It's never an exclusion to the others because you've got an idea about the plan of the whole, but trying to get every room to be perfect unto itself, but with a very good relationship to its neighbours, is the thing I think that classicism has taught us.
Yeah, I mean, we often talk to our students about, buildings in, say, Bloomsbury, for example, the Georgian buildings there. They were built as houses. Some of them were built as quite grand houses, but lots of them are not houses anymore. They're shops and they're universities and they're doctors' surgeries. The houses are well planned. The rooms are kind of really nicely proportioned. They've got beautiful windows. Everyone wants to be in there, and it doesn't really matter too much what you do in that room, but the kind of the sort of physical qualities of the space mean that, as Tim says, they're valued, so they haven't been knocked down, but they're also immensely flexible. They're just good spaces.
I want to understand your journey, from first sketch And this is a little bit about, why do you get out of bed in the morning? Where do you feel most alive through that project? Do you doubt yourselves at any points? And where do you feel most empowered?
There are things to enjoy and to be excited about in every step of a project. Architectural projects take quite a while, so being at the beginning of one is always quite exciting.
Also, like a new relationship, I think it's quite satisfying when you as you start working through options, you start to feel that you're giving them what they want, but also that they're getting excited about it as well. I mean, we enjoy design work because that's that's why we do what we do. Kind of satisfaction, that it's great doing initial pencil sketch when you think, oh, it's all starting to come together. I think this can work. That is really exciting.
Well, that's at quite a high level at that point too.
Yeah, strategic almost.
Yeah.
But then there's also kind of satisfaction, slightly nerdier satisfaction about really crunching through and getting a particular detail to work. Particularly in London, we're often working in quite tight spaces. The sites are very constrained, and so that means that often the detailing has to be quite careful, and it can be sometimes technically quite challenging. But that's also enjoyable and in a different way to the soft pencil sketches.
Well, it's also a bit more within our own control, and maybe when we're doing the detailed specifications, obviously we're still speaking to the client about design matters, but a lot of it is not design matters. It's technical matters, so we'll be speaking to suppliers and manufacturers. And that's a nice set of work to have in the office, because you can just concentrate on it, and it's sort of between us and some sort of trusted suppliers and consultants. And then obviously building it. Site,
when it starts to be built, that's really exciting. The beginning is very exciting and the end is very exciting, and the middle bit can sometimes be a bit trying.
If we could ignore that tedious bit in the middle, then we get the inspiration at the beginning and the beautiful building at the end, we'd all be really happy.
But it is really exciting seeing it being built, and I think we usually retained by our clients throughout the construction phase.
But it's also this detailed set of drawings is we're sort of building the project in our minds, and this is the thing that can be very satisfying as an architect, is you're always thinking about the bigger picture. Maybe a little bit like being a film director or something like that, that when you've got all these caterers and accountants and lawyers and actors and makeup people running around, you're the one who really has got the vision. And so you'll deal with the issues that the decorator might raise, or the structural engineer, or some unforeseen issue with a bit of existing building that wasn't quite how you thought it had been. But in working that out, you know what you're trying to achieve. You know what you can't. The builder might say, "Oh, well, we can just do this." No, hang on. Let me think. Let's go back to the drawings. Yes, you could do that, but that will compromise the staircase when that goes in 3 months' time. So just give us a couple of days to work our way around this. And that, of course, you'd rather these things didn't crop up, but they're always going to. And it's enjoyable to be in the middle and to kind of hold the sort of control and the vision in this set of drawings.
Your teaching side, there will be a lot of people that are watching this who don't know your teaching side. So I'd love you to give a bit of an intro in terms of what you do outside of your day-to-day and your architect practice, but also how that aspect of your careers influences your architectural practice, and also vice versa.
Well, right at the beginning, actually before we started teaching, it was clear to us that the architects, the modern architects, the contemporary architects we most admired, also taught. And it was also clear from our experience that good teachers were very often architects, practicing architects. So that we saw before we had the chance, before we'd been offered the opportunity to teach.
And they were often using their studios in the university to work through ideas which the practice was interested in. But they were setting their studios interesting architectural questions which they wouldn't necessarily have the time or the space to explore in practice. And then the students were getting a lot out of that, but it was also clear that it was feeding back into sort of the ideas of the practice as well.
We were teaching ourselves classicism alongside the students. because we hadn't been taught it ourselves. So we were reading the books that we then set for them. And then it turned out that we were teaching a classical studio, and it happened to be the first one in the UK since before the Second World War. It turned out that we'd almost by accident set up the first classical professional architecture course in the UK for 80 odd years.
It's a real validation of your skill set and, you know, the hard work that you have put into, you know, reading around the topic. And if there was a glut of teaching resource, there's an awful lot of people that are trusting that you know your stuff.
But it's also, it moves quicker. Every year you've got a new batch of students and you set a new project. We set projects that are really, mostly they're things we'd like to build ourselves. And through the students we're designing 15 different versions of something that we'd really love to do. And that's really nice because you never get to do the same architecture project twice. They're always a prototype in a way. They're always bespoke. They're always a one-off. So as a very small practice ourselves, that's where we get our sort of culture from on a weekly basis.
What would you hope your clients would know about you before they have that first meeting?
We're really nice guys. Fees are quite reasonable. I'd say we don't write with quill pens. We're modern people. We're normal people. Because sometimes there's a sort of stereotypical, oh, you do our classical architecture because you just wish it was the Empire again and all that. Yeah, there's plenty of stuff to be nostalgic about, but I don't think we're overly nostalgic people. There's a really broad and creative middle ground, and that is where I suppose we see ourselves.
Well, when you say middle ground, you mean between modernism and classicism?
Between a sort of straightforward modernism and straightforward classicism. Most of the architecture that we like is somewhere in between.